If you were around the Yu-Gi-Oh community on Twitter around the Thanksgiving weekend, then you know a conversation was sparked around what exactly constitutes a bad deck. In this video, I want to talk about what exactly makes a bad Yu-Gi-Oh deck and in what context should you consider a deck bad or not bad. I'm Ashton or SmashtonYGO, so let's talk about bad Yu-Gi-Oh decks. So the entire conversation kind of started around this video about Ursarctic and how it was kind of a failed archetype or a bad deck, so to speak, and certain Ursarctic players had a little bit of beef with that. And I totally get it, because if you have an archetype or a deck that you love very, very much, and it kind of gets called a failure or outright bad, but you personally are really invested into it, I can understand where that can come off as insulting and you may feel the need to defend it. Look, one of my favorite decks of all time is Gladiator Beast, and today, right now, if you try to play Gladiator Beast, it's probably not going to work out for you. Not only because it hasn't gotten support in so long, but also because its game plan is just a little too slow and awkward for the current game as it stands. And that's kind of where I want to start this conversation off at. If you're looking from a pure modern Yu-Gi-Oh competitive point of view, then there are in fact good and bad decks. Unfortunately, unlike a lot of different pieces of art, card games that are competitive like this can end up getting split between competitive and non-competitive. And when it comes to certain decks, like Gladiator Beast, like Ursarctic, some decks just can't compete at the level that other decks can. It's just like sports, right? Where sometimes you have a sports team or a player who is just head and shoulders above the rest in the group. And it really just comes down to their skill level, comes down to how good they are, their talent, and how much work they put in, and the kind of player that they are in the kind of era that they are in. There's always sort of a debate in the NBA about like old players versus new players, and how the old NBA was a lot harder to play in and the new NBA is a lot more, foul friendly and a lot more safe for the players. And the same can kind of be considered for Yu-Gi-Oh, right? A good deck from back in Yu-Gi-Oh's early days, like 2003, 2002, even 2005, it's not going to compete in the modern metagame. The game has evolved, it has moved forward, and those decks are just too slow. Now, when it comes to Ursarctic, that's not exactly an old deck. Ursarctic is not that old of an archetype compared to something like Gladiator Beast, right? Which is one of the first archetypes, maybe even the first archetype ever fully realized. But at the same time, I think there is a level of kind of being real about your deck. It's one thing to have a pet deck or your favorite deck, and another thing to compare it to something like the top meta and try to get upset because it gets called bad. Like, if Ursarctic was a really high competitive meta deck, then I promise you the meta players would know, and they would be testing it out and labbing it out as we speak. Now, I will say that there is a consideration and a point to saying that not every format and not every deck is being tested to its full potential. Some decks are getting tested way more than others, and especially new strategies are always going to take precedent over old strategies, because typically the way power creep works in Yu-Gi-Oh, the new strategies are going to be more powerful by and large. I mean, just look at past history. Tier Limit became a tier 0 format. What happens after it gets hit in the ban list? Well, a new series of cards, Kashtira, is still the best deck. What happens after that? A new series of cards called Pearly. You don't really see old archetypes really getting into the very top of the top meta anymore. It's pretty much always some new stuff. And so I think there is an argument to be made that not every archetype is being labbed out or tested out as much as it could be, and maybe there's some potential in certain archetypes that people just aren't thinking about. But I think by and large, the reason why that happens is because those archetypes just kind of got left behind and the new stuff is just better. Take Salamangreat, for instance, my personal favorite deck of all time. Originally came out in 2019, and while yes, it does still see some meta play, it does see some rogue play and has topped regionals and has toppings here and there, it's not quite in the top rung, and it only got to that point because of new support and some help from getting cards off the ban list like Salamangreat Circle and Gazelle. Otherwise, I don't think we'd be really seeing Salamangreat all that often. I'm all for older decks getting support and then becoming meta. Take Unchained as an example, a really powerful meta deck right now, but it wasn't really meta and hasn't really been tested before the new cards came out. Was it still fine? Was it still a cohesive strategy? Sure, but it wasn't going to top a regional or especially a YCS or nationals. It just wasn't going to happen. But with the new support, now it can do that and quite often does. And this is kind of where the next part of it comes in, is the argument that what is a bad deck? Is it just a deck that is bad in the current meta format, or is it a deck that doesn't accomplish anything? Ursartic is a deck that certainly does accomplish something. It has a certain game plan, it has a strategy that it wants to get done, and it can accomplish that. And I think that really is a byproduct of modern Konami and Yu-Gi-Oh! Just card design, is they typically don't release archetypes that just don't do anything anymore, or like don't properly work correctly. Typically, Konami's pretty good at making a deck do what it's supposed to do properly the first time. And so when you compare that to another strategy, like let's say Gate Guardian pre-support, I can see the argument to where you're saying like that is clearly a bad deck. It doesn't really do anything. There's nothing that it particularly wants to do. And what it could want to do, it doesn't really even accomplish that. Yes, clearly that is like the dog bottom, dog poop pile of bad in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! But I think when we're talking about bad decks, that's not exactly what we're talking about. Most decks can accomplish something and have a game plan that it can accomplish. I mean, you take like Laval, for example, like it can get synchros sometimes, but like obviously it's too slow and it's not very good. And all of the Laval cards are either extremely powerful and banned, like Laval Chain, or are just kind of horrible. But that doesn't make it a good deck. Like, sure, it can get some synchros out, but it's still a pretty bad deck. And I'm not trying to compare Laval to Ursartic 1-to-1, but just the point being is that just because a deck can do and accomplish what it wants to, doesn't mean that it's good, it's just coherent. It is a deck strategy that has something to do, but that doesn't make it good. And again, this is strictly speaking from a meta, current competitive format Yu-Gi-Oh! Standpoint, because that's pretty much all we have right now. If we're talking about casual, then things change a lot. And this will go from whether you're playing sealed formats, or if you're just playing an older format, or if you're just playing with friends and you decide that as a friend group you want to play certain decks or maybe non-competitive strategies, then this completely changes. From that perspective, then yes, sometimes even bad decks from our current competitive point of view can be considered pretty good, especially in like sealed environments. For example, if you've ever done like a progression series of your own, well then you'll know that certain strategies are really, really good because they're low rarity and easy to get, like let's say Blackwing. Blackwing's a really incredible strategy once you get to that era because they're easy to pull for the most part and are pretty easy to play and cobble together. But something more powerful like Boojins later on that are extremely high rarity, a little bit harder to do because you just don't have the cards, right? But when you access everything, when you open the card pool to every card available in Yu-Gi-Oh! That's legal, and you make every card available at 3 and you can just build whatever you want, well, that's when the cracks start to show in that armor of the old sealed way of playing. If you're an Ursartic player or a player who plays what many would consider to be a bad deck, then I would like to hear from you down below. Because if you want to say something like Ursartic isn't a bad deck, I want to hear your reasons. And I also want to hear where is the bar. Because I personally don't believe that the bar can be too low, because then pretty much any deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Can be called good, or at least the majority of them can be called good just because they have a coherent strategy. If the bar is as low as coherent strategy, then I think that's a little too like low of expectations. But if the bar is somewhere in the middle, like old casual strategies don't work, but anything that's like kind of modern can work, then I guess I can kind of be with you. But at the same time, that kind of just goes with the power creep, and I'm not sure if I fully get behind that either. So I'm super curious on what your thoughts are down below. I would love to hear them and what exactly you consider a bad deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think that's where my final stance will kind of be on this issue. I think I would consider a bad Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck to just be anything that is not going to hold a candle to the modern competitive format, whether it be top meta or rogue. If it's not even in the rogue conversation, I think it kind of can be considered bad. Now, things can sneak in here and there, and things can make some shocking tops here and there, and that's fine. But I think certain decks just obviously just cannot carry the same weight and are not in the same weight class as others, and that's where I think my line is drawn. If we're talking casual, that changes everything, and kind of everything gets thrown out the window, because you can kind of do whatever you want if you make up your own format or play weaker formats or older formats or whatever. That's its own beast, and if you want to like call your deck good in those formats or like in your own casual format, that's perfectly fine. If that's what's fun, go for it. But I think we have to be a little bit real with ourselves, that just because we have a pet deck that we love and we adore and we want people to try it out and we want it to be good, sometimes we have to be real with ourselves and accept that's not always the case, and sometimes that's okay. It's okay to enjoy a deck that isn't necessarily competitively viable. That's perfectly fine. It doesn't mean that you're a lesser player or a lesser person. You just like that deck, and that's perfectly fine. And hey, there's always the chance that Konami will actually print more support and make it even more viable, just like they did with Unchained, just like they did with Salamangreat, just like they did with so many other archetypes throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. So again, if you like this style of video, make sure to subscribe down below so you never miss one of them, and comment down below what you think about this topic. What is a bad Yu-Gi-Oh deck, and where is the bar? And what bad quote-unquote Yu-Gi-Oh deck I've given up mine as Gladiator Beast. I would love to hear what yours are. Make sure to leave a like, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.